currently work at Infinite Energy, which is being acquired by Gas South. So I'll soon be maybe working for Gas South. I don't know. But I'm a developer, but I have an avid interest in user experience.
Awesome. So thank you again all for joining us this evening. I have just a couple of housekeeping items that I want to go through before we formally introduce Michael. First off, we do have closed captioning available via Rev, and we'll be recording this meeting. So following our discussion today, if you want to refer back to it, share it with anyone, we will be posting it to our YouTube channel. So keep an eye out for the link within the Meetup group page. I'll be posting it, I think, on this actual event, so you can keep an eye out for it there. We also on YouTube have been posting our previous meetups as well. So if you're interested in scoping out some of the previous talks that we've had over the last few months, feel free to take a look there. As I said, I'll share that link out with the greater meetup group, but also within this event. I will ask that everybody mute yourselves while Michael's talking, just to keep any background noise down. I know a lot of us are working from home, and as a result, there can be a lot of just ambient noise going on with kids or animals making noises, that kind of thing. And then lastly, as a reminder, our meetups are typically on the first Tuesday of the month, as opposed to this one, which is the second. We want to make sure we didn't interfere with everyone's election day activities. And so we did postpone for this week, but normally it will be the first Tuesday, and our next one will be December 1st. So tonight we'll be hearing from Michael, and who is our very gracious host here. I realized everybody's screens are in different places, but anyway, Michael is the Director of Engineering at WhereByUs in the Miami-Fort Lauderdale area. And given his experience working with cross-disciplinary roles, I'm really excited for him to be speaking today on how we don't, in fact, need UX in our titles. So Michael, despite you being a FSU alum, by my understanding, I am thrilled to have you here. So thank you so much for coming and joining us, and I will let you take it away.
Yeah, thank you. I actually, I was an FSU student while living in Gainesville, which was like really difficult to do. I lived over like by Archer, and yeah, yeah. So thanks for like taking the time. I got to tell you, it's because like the state of the world. It's been a while since I talked to anyone, both because like every conference that I tend to go to was canceled. All the meetups around here were canceled. And also because the company I work for is chose to pivot into like a software as a service. And we've been like hustling like a pre-yearling company to hit certain milestones that are due in like 3 weeks. So it's been really crazy. And I guess that's all to caveat that I am going to stutter a lot and say all the time. And yeah. And so like, in fact, I totally like, I'm watching chat and stuff like that. I definitely prefer, like, as things come up, to be willfully distracted. So as you all have questions, if any, please get me going on a tangent. I think that tends to make a talk better, so no one's just watching me click through some slides. But I got some slides, so we'll do that. There are probably too many slides, so rather than like race through them all, we'll wing this a little bit. But here's the introduction to my slides. So like, as I try to share my screen to show them to you, I want to show you just the presenter view and not the fact that I've got like my notes on the other side. There we go. I think this will do it. Nope. That was my preview. Sorry, this is great entertainment. Here we go. So you should all see like some slides, right? Is that correct? Okay, sweet. So here's the deal. So the point of this talk is to provide some degree of hope that, hey, you don't need a user experience title to do this kind of work. But a lot of it kind of a lot of that thinking relies on having a practical vocabulary around UX and working in terms of like UX as a system where ultimately like the user experience is a metric. The reason this comes up and is like a big thing for me is that, you know, I started as I was like the lead user experience developer, and things change. And so now most of my job has to do with engineering and managing like our developer and design teams. In fact, we ended up eliminating the user experience position we had because there is this phenomenon. Let me see if I can find the specific slide. This is why I like to just bounce around a lot. There's this idea where the maturity, I don't have a slide for this, but you may have seen that there are user experience maturity models. The one that I like comes in a stack where that has five blocks on it. The bottom layer is to illustrate the user experience maturity of a company that is 0, so relatively immature, where decisions are made in a waterfall style. The CEO or whomever, the boss, is making all of the strategic decisions without any kind of preliminary research, like officially not user-centric at all, right? And that maturity model continues upward until it gets to like the 5th block, the top. And at the very top of these kind of UX maturity models, you often see this trend where they call out companies like Disney and some others, where the idea is that user experience isn't a thing on the to-do list. It isn't a task. It is the essence of the business of the company, right? So there's no like UX researcher, or there's no UX person who's deciding to pump popcorn smells into the Magic Kingdom, right? The idea is that user experience is endemic to the way the company works. A lot of the times when like in prior companies that I've been in, when I joined WhereByUs, it was kind of at this layer. A lot of companies who do, I think, really good UX work are usually a 3 on this maturity model on a scale of 0 to 5, and that 3 is something where like, hey, they have like, you not only have a number of people voluntarily advocating for user-centric decisions and the user experience, but you probably even have dedicated roles, even if it's just a part-time thing. The idea that a company has allocated some salary or some budget to performing user experience tasks, whether that's building and creating like the look and feel, or performing the research that provides the insight that leads to that building. The idea that there's any kind of like officially allocated budget for UX is really a great sign. And I think some of us can think that, oh gosh, there's only one UX person in the company, or maybe there's a UX department. That's better, but it's UX still isn't like swinging the big hammer. But the reality is that most of these companies are way better off in terms of like user centricity than a lot. What was the point that I was trying to make? And so the idea is that like at level 3-ish, you have dedicated user experience roles, because for a variety of reasons, the way the company works requires that someone has this agenda, this UX agenda that they always have to kind of push and advocate for and make things for. The transformation happens like as a company becomes more UX-y, that ultimately, like at, let's say like the Disney level, although increasingly I don't think that's a great example, but it's the best I got. But at this kind of like high level where user experience is how you work, how the entire company works, the reality is that kind of obsolesces the need for dedicated user experience folks. And it's an antithetical goal as a UX person to make yourself obsolete. But it is, I think, the goal to have, but it raises those questions as to like, what do you do after you make yourself obsolete in the way that we made my user experience role obsolete, et cetera, et cetera. Hence the purpose of this talk. Increasingly, we want to be able to craft organizations, even if they're very small teams and we're just working on little side projects, but we all want to be able to craft teams and organizations that are like UX first, right? Like the user centricity, the UX research part is part of the daily to-do list, because ultimately that creates way better products and services, but also, I don't know, maybe that's enough. All that to say, thus the point that you don't need UX in your title, and that actually being an end state goal for you as you like progress in your career. All this begins with needing to have like kind of like this practical belief, right? Or this practical vocabulary, excuse me. So going forward, where are we? Like it starts with this idea that this practical application of being able to talk about UX as a piece of the system has some like hardcore early wins, that not being able to communicate like this is going to prevent you from ultimately being able to like allocate the budget to the UX work that you want to do. You want to do more UX research at your company. You have to convince the people who are going to dole those dollars out that UX research is worth it. The user experience work, whether you're doing research or like, again, like the build phase, is fundamentally about advocacy. And because it is an advocacy centric job, your ability to do great UX works depends on your ability to be kind of like political about it. I just have like these random slides in here. This was to kind of demonstrate that, hey, like as the organizational user experience maturity goes up on this chart, the cost gets driven down. And that's good. That's what we want. Let me skip to, if you guys see a slide, I'm going to skip around because these are long. This is why you want to increase UX maturity by obsolescing yourself. Here we go. Let's start with this. So here's the thing. So the problem with like UX as a discipline is that none of us actually know how to talk about it in a sane way. If you look for UX jobs on Indeed.com, you're going to find an assortment of roles that are being a front-end designer or a front-end developer, where your goal is to write React and push pixels around that are given to you potentially by another UX role, a visual designer whose their entire job is living in Figma and creating mock-ups and wireframes. This kind of lack of consistent vocabulary in a discipline that is increasingly getting wind under its sails, there's so many new UX roles like emerging, is a real detriment to our ability to progress as a discipline. So I always kind of like start off everything by suggesting a working vocabulary, one that doesn't feel good. Like UX isn't about happiness. It's not about making users feel good, but it's about being a practical piece of jargon for your work. So this is all based around the idea that the user experience is a holistic, cumulative metric of a point in time at a point in service for like during a user's journey through the service that you provide, right? It is something that ultimately can be measured. It's fuzzy math. It's never going to get any better than fuzzy. But it is a multifaceted metric in which all I almost swore, all ships rise with the tide. So in this case, a lot of times when we're talking about UX, we're talking about the look and feel and the design, the border radius, and things like that. But the reality is that a quantitative like UX metric is measured by its usability, its civic and its civic role and its ethical role, its accessibility, its credibility. One of the great like examples that I like to use is something like Craigslist, right? Where no one would think that Craigslist is fundamentally a positive user experience, right? But the notion is that, you know, despite it looking really quite basic and there not being any kind of like joy built into it, its usability and accessibility and its findability, the ability to complete a specific job to be done on Craigslist ultimately overpowers its lack of aesthetics, and it creates basically a net positive user experience. This is just kind of a graph that you can make using something called the Kano model, and this is just to kind of like bullet point or underscore the point I'm making, that you can graph user experience going up and down. This is specifically a satisfaction metric. I love to talk about the Kano model if anyone wants to get me on that. But the idea is to become comfortable, I think, with this notion that UX is quantifiable, and as we talk about it, especially in our work, we want to refer to a metric where ultimately it correlates with success. We want to push UX up and to the right, because that means the people who make the money decisions are also returning on that investment. Oops, there we go. And a lot of that is because there's this thing that I think some of you may know. It's a marketing theory that's evolved a lot since I snagged these screenshots, but it's called aggregation theory. There's a blog/newsletter called Stratechery, written by Ben Thompson. He's the one who dreamt this up. But aggregation theory is the marketing theory that, hey, when there are basically three facets to a business: the production of the thing, the distribution of the thing, and sort of like the consumption of that thing. Prior to the internet and internet services, right, you win business by producing more than your competitor or distributing better than your competitor. And you know, the consumption part is just one of three different paths that you can take. But when the production is free or cheap, and the distribution is free or cheap, i.e., producing like a podcast or something, you can distribute it to 1 million people for no cost, as long as it's there. That removes at least one, if not both, the different facets of this this business model, thus aggregating it, where basically the differentiator becomes the consumption of it. So aggregation theory suggests that good UX is good for business, right? And I usually just use aggregation theory as a tool to make a point to the people who are holding the checkbook. But it's generally true. This is kind of like a dated example, but let's say you have something like Uber and Lyft pre the new California law. Let's roll back the clock and say Uber and Lyft 5 years ago, before one was less deceptively evil than the other. But like at their start, they fundamentally did the exact same task, right? You know, like you can roughly, like, I think that's a roughly agreeable sentiment. But the one that did it better, faster, was Uber. And Uber took huge leaps ahead of Lyft. A lot of that is based on the work that they put into their app interface, right? People are loyal to the best user experience provided. UX is the differentiator. Putting money into UX is a great business investment, right? That's sort of like the thinking here. And so being able to like put some oomph behind that UX metric and being able to communicate that and talk about the user experience in that way is going to lead, so you can convince people to better success metrics that you care about, whether that's traffic or downloads or engagement, things of that sort. Also leads to filter bubbles. If you ever look at The Social Dilemma, Ben Thompson predicted the early election of Donald Trump based off of aggregation theory. In this kind of like way, without any kind, without like, let me like erase like judgy words from my vocabulary for a second. But the argument is that the campaign of like end of 2015 was ultimately a superior user experience from one party to the other, right? And so with like aggregation theory, like you made a guess early in that campaign. It's just interesting to like look at things through the lens of aggregation theory. What am I trying? Oh yeah, and so I want to skip around a little bit. Yeah, okay. So because the whole point of this is just to have like a vocabulary. So if UX is the metric, user experience is an indicator. Good UX goes up, bad UX hurts business. Then the thing that we are doing, I'd like to propose is service design. User experience design is the work of strategically trying to push that UX metric higher, and service design is the functional practice of providing the services that push that UX metric higher. Anyway, this is all about me like deconstructing like what the UX role is, and and we're all actually like service designers in a way, and just to kind of like divorce our ideas from what that UX, what it is that we do. How do I go to next? Yeah, so we are all in the practice of designing for those services. Service design is sort of like a once you start getting into this language of talking about services, and the work you're doing is designing services that have a user experience impact. It's Kool-Aid like, and you can't help, I think, but start talking in the language of service design all the time. But my point is that basically everything is a service. Every business is a service business. And the way to kind of like illustrate this is basically in a talk I was giving some time ago. I was trying to make the case that folks overemphasize the impact that product has on an organization's success. And I was never really good at slides. So I showed them this dot on a blank white screen. And I saw that most people in the front row were giving like really like obvious like WTF faces. But my point was trying to be like, when people talk about their product, their website or their podcast or their phone or their app, and they think desperately about their product design, the look and feel, the border radius, how fast it loads and stuff. Folks are moving, or they're focusing a lot of attention on a very specific point in an ecosystem that is exceptionally more complex. You're looking at what is just a temporary stop on a larger journey. And that journey has multiple stops, most of which begin and end outside of your app. Your thing is just a stepping stone along the way. I think it's easier for us to then accept that, this user experience isn't just a holistic and cumulative measure of a single thing, but of a specific time on a journey, and a journey that is composed of many, many user experiences. Like so, I was a librarian at a time, and so trying to design for a higher education library experience requires understanding that the library is not the end destination for most of those users. This is me making more and more of a point about that. I'm just trying to see if there's any like chats as well. Feel free to distract me. I have like a ton of slides, but I'm happy to continue talking about anything. I think what's happened is that I have a lot of slides, but I'm dissatisfied sort of in the direction they're going, because I want to really talk about, I think, the process. I think let's do some skipping here. Let me see if I can share my screen. So there's this thing. I'm going to jump down to slide 59. Right. So I told you I was a little nervous. I'm kind of disoriented. Bam. Okay. So here's the thing. So if you accept this argument without me having to make it a lot, that the UX is a metric, and that we're talking about a thing that goes up and down based off basically how much, I don't know, how much time you invest in the user experience, that can be seen as, that can be abstracted to not the effort of an individual or a few in a department, but into a system of how people work. And ultimately, like from this kind of like observation, there emerged this community that I recommend you all check out, called Research Ops. Worth Googling. It's a great Slack community. It's a great idea. But the idea is it's in the vein of design ops or dev ops, etc. Research ops is the idea of trying to systematize the user experience research work so that it can be ultimately democratized throughout the company. Like, how do you get your customer service people, or if you're working in like a physical area, how do you get your front desk people to perform user experience research for you as they are doing their job, ultimately populating a library of insight from which decisions are made. This is, let me stop sharing my screen here, and I'll show you a couple of tabs I have open. If I can, here we go. Oh yeah, Michelle pasted a link to the Research Ops community. Let me share now my slides from my actual browser. Screen one. Okay. So in terms of like systematizing like the UX work we do, so that again, like you're constantly in the process of performing this user experience research. The big thing is there's two factors here. One is having like a user experience research library that I'm just making sure you guys can see the screen, right? Like, hello, the
yeah, we see
WhereByUs. Sweet,
yeah.
Man. So the idea is like the research library as a tool, or the research repository that has become kind of like the de facto lingo of like research ops, becomes like an incredibly important backbone of being able to perform like perform the work, the user-centric work at scale, and by folks who aren't dedicated to a user experience role. At a very like simple like view, this could just be like a Google Doc, right? A spreadsheet. This is an Airtable specifically. There are other like actual tools out there that you can pay like monthly or yearly subscriptions to. But the idea is that provided that you have like a consistently maintained central repo for just all of your data points, qualitative data points, or whatever you want to put in here, is like 50 to 60% of the work of being able to, I use this term already, like democratize that user experience research across multiple different roles. The second part is ultimately having a top-down pressure. So some sort of, this is where the advocacy and the diplomacy of like UX work comes in, but basically being able to have like the leadership of your organization push down and stress that like I work on a code software product. So our thing would be like, we can't begin building or writing code for a thing until it is represented in the user research library. So one of the things that happened was that when we decided to kind of like change and grow and other folks left, the first thing I did as like a user experience developer lead, where my job was essentially to come in to like, do some development, but also help take what was a already like super user enthused company. Everyone cared, like we were in the local news business. So like everyone fundamentally cared about their very specific hyper local communities. We have a thing called the New Tropic, which is, Miami itself. We have Pulp Town, which is Orlando. And the content was created in these communities were facilitated by folks who really like fundamentally did care about the well-being of their communities, but that also served like a real business purpose where because things like local news in our case ended up kind of getting gobbled up by larger national news publications or even statewide like news publications, there was basically a dearth of good local things. So just essentially by knowing what the community, the very specific community wanted to read and listen to and writing to it, ultimately grew that base. It sounds super obvious, but like it's a key point of like having your finger on the pulse and doing that, even if you didn't call it that user experience work up front, was critical to being able to grow these things. So one of the functions that I had was to essentially help systematize this as we go. We ended up introducing like a research repository. I have a template here of this that's empty that I can share with all of you. But at a glance, this is a spreadsheet on steroids. There's nothing particularly fancy about it. Like at a glance, it's just like every row here is a piece of data that came in that we just happened to capture. In this case, they're from like, what's this one from? Yeah, so we had like an NPS survey that went out like every like month or so, and people could comment on that, and we just dropped these in here. So it's literally like every row is something someone said that we transcribed or it came in through chat and we thought it was interesting and we dropped it down. We ripped off like some other folks' processes for doing something with this data, but ultimately, this this spreadsheet, became like part of like a larger workflow where once we have like the raw data, we synthesize it into observations and give it like a variety of like rankings and stuff. And then from those observations, we try to derive insights about specific products and specific tasks, whether or not they're actionable, whether or not we need more, right? And eventually, just things changed, and we had we had an opportunity where, gosh, I could manage the engineers. That's what I'm doing now. And we never filled that original position I had because we got everybody else in the company to use this, right? And so in a way, like the user experience work I was doing became a I don't know, a list of Google Docs explaining the process, and an Airtable, and ultimately became instructions so that everybody could start populating into this. At that point, what happened is that is kind of what am I trying to say? There's an organizational mental shift where now that nobody is doing the user experience work, we implemented something called discovery validated delivery. It's ultimately just a way of forcing pressure from on top to create a workflow. This is a really bad sketch. To create basically a workflow where, in fact, this may even be blurry on your screens. But basically where the need, research becomes insight, which becomes basically a to-do list. It's we need to change these labels because people are confused, things like that, which creates work. So the developers change those labels, the designers change those labels. And because of those changes, that inspires new feedback. Ultimately, it requires new testing. Even if it's live testing, we just make the change, but we start collecting new feedback. And so feedback spikes around these changes because nobody likes a change, even if it's a welcome one, right? And then that feedback goes into our table, becomes observations, gets distilled into these insights, which fuel more changes. And it's just kind of a process that we kind of dubbed a service reactor, where with as long as we have the downward pressure of forcing the process, hey, no cheating, we can't take cuts, we want to make this border radius, or we want to, I don't know, we want to make the heading blink on the screen over and over and over again. We can't do that unless our research suggests it. As long as we have that downward pressure there, we ultimately are able to fuel a workflow at the organization, at organizational scale, that is ultimately providing research insights, and producing surveys and inspiring tests of that sort. So I had to be real, I had and still struggle with this crisis of identity, because I bill myself essentially as a service designer, who does this kind of work, where I specialize in systematizing the research process, the research ops. But 99% of my day is looking at code and doing overhead and stuff. And I'm not really doing any kind of user experience work at all. Traditionally, right? I'm not performing any of the research. I'm not producing any of the surveys. I'm not even managing the Airtable, someone else is doing that. I'm not doing jack. It's still something I think about a lot. And it's one of those things where I've decided to fall back on a blog so I can just get the UX itch out. But the reality is, I do engineering now. And one of the things that became an important aha moment, after I obsolesced myself, was that, frankly, if you do the mental gymnastics and you talk about user experience in a certain way, like as a metric, up, down, and you can make organizational or workflow changes at your level, whatever your scope is, whether you can just inspire change at a change in workflow just at the team, or you have like a couple departments under you, or whatever, like at any level, that ultimately points them in the direction of consistently pushing that user experience metric up, right? And so, because like, frankly, yeah, like ultimately that UX is a critical indicator of your business success. And whether you're like me and you're like in like development hell all the time, trying to figure out like a command line thing or not, the reality is like without that UX metric constantly going up, you're probably out of a job ultimately, right? You're not going to be able to get funded to do the kind of work that you're doing. This level of mental gymnastics leads you to, I think Jared Spool said something that I rolled my eyes at really hard, but it's fundamentally true. The whole like we're all user experience designers, but it's functionally true. As long as you're like strategically oriented at improving this indicator, that's correct. And it comes to the point where basically like, as you think about UX in that way, you don't need UX designers at all. And that's sort of like where I'm at now.
So Michael, we have a question from Melissa.
Yes, please. Thank you. Oh my God. Yeah. Stop me.
Melissa, do you want to speak to your question?
Sure. I was just wondering, after I saw your spreadsheet that showed the different pain points, and I was wondering what you found are the most effective ways that you can illustrate to the higher ups.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, are you familiar with, did you freeze up? Oh no. Okay. Are the rest of you familiar with this idea of interaction cost? Does this ring true? Interaction cost is this fuzzy math where, like, imagine you have a task. You're going to, you have to find, I think I'm still screen sharing. You have to find a specific sample by a specific person about a specific thing, right? You have a job to be done. The interaction cost is this notion that from zero, like, so probably starting from like Google or a blank screen or DuckDuckGo or whatever, but like from zero, every step you take from locating with your eyeballs the tab to clicking the tab to scrolling to reading again, etc., can all be incremented, right? So, oh, I have to find the samples tab, +1. I have to scroll, +2. I have to read every single time I read, that's +1. And then I have to select it, +1, etc. And it just continues to go up and up. So it's a real thing that interaction cost correlates with lost profit, right? So if you can show this, it's tricky. You kind of need to have like just a ton of data using tools like Hotjar or whatever. It doesn't matter, but you basically need to be able to show something that I think we all fundamentally know, that if you have to click 10 times, you're going to bail out of your cart before you click submit or something like that, right? So this is the thing of interaction cost, and this is true for everything. So in terms of like illustrating that, you have to find a way, I think, to prove it by money. Here's a great example that I use a lot. How many times have you been part of the process where there is a design and you design, or there's, I don't know, someone gives you a design or you make a design, it gets built, someone else doesn't like it, you change it, it gets rebuilt or something like that, right? It's this idea of like redesigning. It's like, oh, we're going to launch this, and ooh, they don't like how this heading is up here. We got to move it 3/4 down the screen. Someone's always constantly making changes. Those are expensive changes to make, right? It would fundamentally cost the company less to get it right the first time, right? I mean, it sounds silly, but like the reality is like every time you have a thing like that, which is fundamentally the result of poor discovery, poor user research, right? If you just put the user research up front, you're going to save countless engineering hours, designer hours, etc. Like however you want to quantify that. The only way I've ever had this work is by talking about the money. You don't have to even give them real money. You can say like, hey man, this person has this salary and it just took them like 10 hours to make this change you wanted, when we could have figured that out like before doing that. So yeah, you have to kind of like attack the money. When it comes to a user, you can follow that if you can track their screens, or you can perform like simple like scenario tests where you just observe them, and it's ultimately cheaper for the entire organization to just. I don't understand why people don't understand this. Like, to just do the research, up front. Hey, welcome back. So I don't know if that helps.
Michael, would you mind, because I know Melissa had some connection problems, would you
Yes.
summating in just like 1 or 2 sentences?
Yeah. So to answer your question, Melissa, in 1 or 2 sentences, the only practical way I've ever been able to change someone's mind to allocate more resources towards user experience, or to change the workflow so that we do the research up front before building it, is by making them think about the money lost by not doing that process. You can demonstrate this a number of ways. Interaction cost is a great one, where the number of steps someone takes, the likely like as that number increases in a process, the more likely they are to bail. Everyone has a threshold of how much they're willing to spend of their interaction, and it's usually pretty low. But there's other ways you can do that too, like calculate like the hourly cost of a project by the salaries of the people who are working on it, especially if that project was something that could have been avoided by spending more time user testing. You almost always save money doing the user testing first. I hope that helps. I love talking about this like political strategy of like UX advocacy. So pummel me with those questions as if you have any more.
So I have one for you.
Yes, please.
I'm curious of your opinion. So in recent UX conferences that I've attended, they've talked a lot about democratized research. And so, particularly on development teams, maybe you have a scrum master who's interested in getting into research, or a designer who's wanting to do research. And so they kind of jump in and they take over that role, because really there is no other UX researcher available, right? So you kind of have this grassroots efforts to create people who can do research. And there's a lot of debate that I've heard back and forth about this around, the effectiveness of being integrated with a team definitely makes democratized research valuable, right? Because you have someone who understands the work and understands how to work with the team, and kind of being fully integrated in that way allows them to have certain efficiencies they wouldn't have otherwise. But conversely, because they aren't research specialists, they may not have the skills necessary to do the particular research. And so I'm curious, given kind of those two camps, where you kind of fall, particularly as you were discussing this idea of, you kind of making yourself obsolete and allowing others to take on the research.
Yeah, like I've heard that too. I think that's, I guess it's a good point occasionally. I think the reality is like the number of like the most impactful research that you can perform in most small to medium, shoot, to even large companies, unless they've been doing this for a long time, isn't that hard. It's that Pareto principle. Like, if you like give someone like perform like 20 surveys and you're going to find 80% of the usability problems that you would find doing some kind of like eye tracking study or something of that sort. My gut is that most people, the return on investment of like really well done research, especially, and I used to work in higher ed, so especially that like like all of the rigmarole involved in like getting IRB approval or something like that, is much lower than just guerrilla testing people like in the street. It does not make so like it does not make financial sense for a company, I think, to prioritize that kind of research over, I don't know, let's call it like lazy UX, like whatever we would want to brand it. And it frankly doesn't usually positively impact the user that much, right? All the amount of A/B testing does you absolutely no good until you've ironed out the 90% of other usability problems that you could find by not A/B testing, right? Whether the button is left or right or up or down or backwards or whatever matters a lot less than if like the font size is big, and you can, and that's kind of my thinking. For us, there is a greater role for there's a greater librarianship role in UX, I think, for most companies. Someone whose job is to maintain the quality of a research repository and foster this tool and be the go-to person to find the right insights for whatever decision is being made. There's a greater role for that than there is for like, I think like an advanced UX researcher, which I think sucks to hear when you're an advanced UX researcher, or the way that I think.
We have a job here, Michael. What's going on?
Yeah. I mean, like, yeah, it's just one of those, like, I love, I'm a research nerd. I've got a master's in library science, right? So like, but the reality is that, I don't know, it hasn't really paid off in terms of like all that work of having a perfectly unbiased survey. Like, okay, like, I mean, like that's bragging rights, but like in terms of like improving a service based off that UX, if your goal is to actually increase the UX metric, that indicator, guerrilla test it and when you get to the point where guerrilla testing no longer does the job, you're in a great position to like hire a more advanced researcher. As long as your surveys, it's easy to make a survey that's not great, but it's hard to make a survey that just really sucks. Like if you're somewhere in the middle, your surveys will be great. Anyone can perform a Kano model survey and get immense insight from that. And just spending an hour and talking to a user will provide plenty of work for your team to do, right? Does that help? I mean, like clearly, so I'm biased.
Yeah, I'm biased as well. I mean, at 352, we have democratized research for the most part. We only have actually one specialist, and she's in our innovation department. And so I'm a big grassroots person. I firmly believe some research is better than no research, even if it's not perfect, and people can grow and learn. So sounds like it's very much in line.
That's a really good point. Sorry, I think we got to go.
But we are at time.
Yeah.
I did want to see if anyone else had any questions before we wrapped up. I know everyone wants to know about my quest too, but I will talk about that later.
I have a question statement. I don't know. I always seem to have question statements, but so for my company currently, the way it is, we don't have a formal UX department. We don't have a team. We have people that do a little bit of UX who know a little bit about UX. So our marketing team knows. People like myself have some interests, so I'm not an expert, but I have been trying to advocate for more UX. And I've actually started a UX guild within the company that has brought in people from like customer care, billing, those kinds of situations where we can more openly talk about UX design for both our internal and external applications. But we don't do a lot with our metrics. We have things like Google Analytics and those kinds of things. So like, I understand where you've been going with the whole talk in terms of not needing UX, but it seems like you started out, at least at WhereByUs, with like this UX role, and then you kind of worked in a direction to be able to eliminate that. Where I feel like I'm kind of going the opposite direction. I'm trying to like get someone who knows UX really well into the company so that we can learn more about it and get it right and start researching it properly, start doing surveys, start doing more of the things that we'd like to do. Now, obviously my company's going through some massive changes right now, but these are still hopes that I have for either a future company or whatever, but I'd still like to see perspective on how you would look at that situation if you were in that particular position.
I think it's still part of the same continuum. I think all good UX work leads to obsolescing the UX individual as a nice blanket statement. But I think the reality is like you can't get to the democratization of that work where it's good and sustainable and constantly returning on your effort without, I think, a step where you have like a dedicated advocate and expert to build that into the system. So I think you can't, this is these maturity models are kind of silly sometimes, but the big point is that like you can't get to 5 by skipping 1, 2, 3, and 4, right? And so I think that's a big thing. Like it's easier if everyone in the company fundamentally agrees that, yeah, man, UX matters, and like we just need to get better at it. You just start running right there. Most companies, you have to convince everybody. You can't. It's harder to scale research without, honestly, without people who can convince the naysayers until there are no longer naysayers. And that's a critical role. So as long as there are expensive naysayers or expensive resistance, so it may not be that anybody disagrees, but budgets are tight, and sometimes you just need to do the thing and go forward. You need somebody that's kind of like an expensive naysaying moment. It's usually, I would argue, saves the organization money to have an expert or experts convince that resistance or massage that resistance out, because that resistance is intuitive. User research does not perform an immediate, tangible, useful deliverable usually, right? It's like, oh, like here's some data, now what do we do with it? And it's an intuitive default that I think organizations have, even if they do care about the users. So when you have those kind of like resistances, when you have that kind of like decision making, heck yeah, it's like you need like UX professionals, and you need the teams there. And if the best way to do that is to embed like a UX person on every product team or whatever, perfect, right? The goal, I think, is ultimately you don't have to convince anybody that this is like a good way to do stuff. And ultimately, I think it just proves itself when you invest in the user experience, you win, right? Or you at least lose less. But I think there's a long way to get there. Does that help? Yeah. So I'm not saying like, get rid of it. I may be saying like, yeah, get rid of UX professionals, like in like kind of like clickbaity way, but like functionally, heck no, you know?
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Any last quick questions?
I had a quick question. So when you come talking about the political aspect of UX research, for example, I worked at a small startup, and I was trying to advocate for user research. Their idea of user research was just looking solely at Hotjar sessions and quantitative data from A/B sessions. And they were mostly, my main goal was working on branding, aligning branding throughout their marketing funnel. But there are definitely some issues when it was a travel company, essentially, like a travel agent. And they were having issues with people going all the way to the end of checking out. And when I was advocating for user research, as far as user interviews, talking to these users, understanding why they didn't want to go all the way to the end, they were pretty hesitant about it. And they just kept going back to, just watch Hotjar sessions. This startup was about maybe 7 people in total, 7 to 8 people. So how do you justify those? I'm so sorry, my Bluetooth headphone just crashed on me. I apologize. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep. Okay. So how do you justify putting in the cost for user research, specifically user interviews? And when you're talking about the dev specifically, the salary of the dev, when we only have one dev who's doing all the work, how would you go about justifying that and playing that political game, especially when you don't have the manpower to democratize the user research?
Oh yeah, I mean that's fun. That's like the Machiavelli level stuff that really gets me going. I'm just formulating my thoughts. Small, scrappy startups do have a problem of basically getting to market fast, right? So there is the point, the practical, greedy point of being super interested in user experience work is that it is a business success indicator. That means that there are legit times where the needs of the business are more valuable, like, than the needs of the user, right? You're like getting to that market. A lot of times, like in terms of engineering, you're creating like a metric ton of technical debt that's going to cost tens of thousands of dollars to refactor. But it doesn't matter unless you get to a level of profitability in a certain time. So those are gambles. I think the big thing for me would be that with a single developer, presumably the time that they spend on building anything is a premium, not because of just cost, but because of constrained talent, right? They're the only person that can presumably fix a specific problem. It is cheaper, basically, a very strong discovery process, whether that's interviews. It doesn't have to be. An interview is ultimately more expensive because it requires an individual for a half hour, an hour at salary. It's cheaper to have like a comment form and just like encourage people to respond a lot there. But ultimately, greater discovery will basically in engineering terms prevent rework, right? Which is a metric that you can track in certain code tools, where hey, you make a thing and then you go back and change it within a certain time frame or whatever. This is rework or refactoring that is not only incredibly expensive, but also tends to lead to an increased rate of bugs entering the system, which ultimately create more expensive problems and more expensive work. it is in the organization's best interest to prevent the developer from doing anything that's not exactly necessary. And you frankly can't be sure until you do the research. Everything else, if like, a lot of startups run on guesses, right? Like I think people have this need, da, da, da. Some of them are lucky. Most startups fail, right? But I would want to be, if it was my money and I had a team of 7, like I was like the VC or whatever, which I wish. I would want to be damn sure that they are building one really good thing rather than one or many guesses that ultimately become more expensive. Like why have your developer spend all their time or spend even like 10% of time fixing bugs that didn't have to be created in the first place? I guess that's how I think about it. Like discovery isn't just about, building the right product or designing the right service, but it's ultimately about preventing work that doesn't need to be done. Sometimes it's better if your developer's not doing shit, and I think that's how I would advocate for it. But there are cases where better to run and break things, and because your guess is really good, or because it doesn't matter if your guess is good or not, you only got 5 months to hit profitability. So that is the other part of the coin. Like sometimes the user experience isn't worth it, right? At least for a little bit.
I'd argue too that you can test in the market. Like it doesn't have to
Sure.
be testing in your sandbox or, on a staging environment. Like you can test in the market and, put it out in front of people, do a diary study, even have people use it long-term, evaluate long-term usage, take it back, fix it, modify it or pivot the product. So, there are times when just moving fast and just seeing how it does is still an effective methodology.
You can also utilize family, friends. You don't have to do expensive research. You can utilize what you have around you to make that happen.
Yeah, that just goes to show.
Thank you so much.
Oh, yeah, that just goes to show that whole yeah, you don't need like great researchers or unbiased people,
Unbiased is generally preferred, but
yeah, sure.
awesome. Well, thank you all for the great questions. Michael, again, thank you for your time this evening. As I said before, the recording of this will be up on our YouTube channel, as well as posted a link in the meetup for this event. If you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out. Michael is on LinkedIn, as well as on the Florida UX, FLUX Slack. So feel free to reach out with any questions there. As a reminder, we will be getting back together on December 1st, same time, same bat channel. And I hope you guys have a great Thanksgiving. Everybody stay safe out there. Wear your masks. Stay 6 feet apart. Wash your hands. Thank you, everybody. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye all.